So this is done in parts, and just to explain the layout of it, I've put a couple of background images on all the div tags or all the tags, and to create a grid so you could visualize the actual grid that is within every tag, every element. And I also put a little numbering thing up to 220 pixels just so you could kind of gauge the number, and hopefully you can also see how it starts to restart at 0 within a tag. So every tag has its own coordinate system inside itself. Okay? So it lives in its parent, which just starts at 0, 0 within itself. And so it has its own coordinate system that's created with its parent, its relationship to its parent. Okay? So I'm sure you've used a grid before in math class, but generally there's just one big grid that everything adheres to, right? You just got one big one and everything's stuck on that coordinate system within that context of that one big grid. What's great and what's confusing about elements is they have a grid system within themselves. And so their children adhere to that system, not one big system. Okay? I'll explain it with action as well. But just to explain what these boxes are about. So let's handle this float question too while we're at it. So this lab also includes the CSS, text wrangler.
Speaking of text wrangler, I tried downloading that Midnight Blue thing. I ended up just making my own though. I couldn't figure out how to install it because I ran into the same problem you did. I couldn't find the directory.
Yeah. I think with the new OS, it's kind of hides those directories for some reason. So if you look, it's just a standard markup, and there's a class called block that's attached to all three of these. So each one of these has the class block, but then they also have individual IDs associated with them, so that we can have a global property set to each one. So each one's going to be 200 by 200 with a margin bottom of 40. But block 1 is going to have a different background color than block 2, than block 3. So if you look, they're all 200 by 200. They all have a bottom margin of 40, but they have different colors.
So this is just mapping out the website, I suppose?
Yeah.
Okay.
So if you look at the structure here, here's the content. That's a parent of these three blocks: block 1, block 2, and block 3. But they also share the same class. Is that understood? Did you guys recall that you can have a class and an ID on the same element, and you can have multiple IDs and multiple classes on the same element too. So you're not limited to just a class or an ID. You can have several. Okay. So this one is like the generic setup. Like I want them all to be 200 by 200, and this one is the specific of that. Specifically, I want this to be pink, and this to be blue, and this to be yellow. Is that clear? Okay, so let's set block to float, and that will affect all of them because all of them have the same class. So if I say float left, they all float left because they all have the same. They all have the same system. They also have the same class associated with them. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So if you look, they're floating side by side. So this is what's happening to yours, Rob, or Robert. What's your pref, Robert?
You can go either way.
Okay. So
I didn't know.
the blue is its parent. It's called content, and it's collapsed. So floating children do not stretch their parents out, unless you apply this property to the parent. So the parent is content, unless you say overflow auto, and then anything underneath won't be affected by that either.
Okay, so just for clarity, could you explain what like the overflow tab like?
Overflow is the overflow property handles anything that moves beyond a box.
Okay.
Right? So any content that moves beyond a box. So most elements just stretch to fit to their content.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Let's take this off for a sec. So I took the float off of that.
So would you have to apply an overflow to pretty much most things?
Well, anything that has floating involved.
Okay, just for floating.
Yeah. Anything that's like has only floating elements, right? Like a nav that only has floating li tags, it's going to collapse because there's nothing that's not floating to make it stretch out. Okay. But overflow controls something else. So let's say the content was had a height of a set amount, like 300 pixels. Because it's set to overflow auto, you get this scroll bar, right? If you take that overflow off, you see how it breaks the bounds? Because this is 200 and this is, there's also overflow hidden. And there's an overflow scroll that'll allow you to scroll it. But the overflow auto is actually kind of a hack fix to our float problem. It's not the only fix. There's a clear solution that we could discuss as well. Okay?
Yep.
Great. So each one of these blocks are 40 pixels. So if you wanted to have space in between each one, you could just give to the block once again, margin, right. I think maybe it's
40. If your box system is also.
yeah. So there's my distance between each one. Okay. So we've gone over. So that's a review. So the beauty of having it on the class is that I don't have to just repeat this on 3 selectors. So if I just have block 1, it only applies to block 1, and then I got to apply it to block 2 and block 3. So if there's 400 of those things in there, I got to make 400 IDs and do that to each one. However, if they share the same class, I only have to target it into one location. So that's a good technique to say, okay, these elements are common, and so I'm going to apply those common properties to a class rather than an ID, which is only one at a time. Make sense? Okay, great. So I'm going to close that out. So I want you to do this exercise, and each one, it tells you at the end to save this, label it floating, so you'll always have an example to go back to. You know what I mean? So you'll always have that solution available to you, because floating is a common problem that students typically forget how to do or have difficulties with.
Now just to clear up, class and ID are basically the same thing. They just have to differentiate so you can do things like that.
Well, conceptually they're the same, except the rules are slightly different. ID can only be used once per page, and just like we all have names that aren't repeated, like you're not Jonathan Harper Fonstock and you're not Jonathan Harper Fonstock, and if we all were, that'd be trouble to identify us, right? So we all have an we have our own individual IDs, my name, your name. So that's what an ID is for. It should only be one per page.
All right.
Okay.
Class is like race
Class.
as opposed to name.
Right, or just human, right? We all have the human class, so we all have, the same kind of characteristics. Or mammal, those are generic things. So we're all, we all have 2 legs and 2 arms, and we all have a head and eyes, and most of us have a head. Does that make sense?
That makes more sense.
So that's what a class is, and so it's the same way as that we've been, that humans tend to divide things up. And it's handy both ways. It's good to have one individual that you can target there, and it's a handy one to say, okay, all humans are going to have these traits. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the difference between those two. Only one class can just repeat, but I should only have one block 2 on this page. And notice I said page and not a website. Whole site is a collection of pages, and you can repeat IDs on every page, but just not. I shouldn't have 2 wrapper 000s or 2 headers. I should only have one. And if I need to repeat something, I use a class. Okay. All right. So positioning. There are 3 different types of positioning. Static positioning, relative positioning. I'm wrong. There are 4. Static positioning, relative positioning, fixed positioning, and absolute positioning. Okay. So to understand this is to have full control over every element on the page. So I think us as designers, we desire this type of control, but we have to work pretty hard to understand how positioning works. But once it's understood, then you're a master. You can put anything wherever you want at any time. Okay? All right. So let's get up here too. So it's a repeated CSS page and structure. So the same structure, different page. We got those 3 blocks, etc. Okay, so let's talk about static positioning. So static positioning, the name static implies that it just stays put, but it's kind of a misnomer. Static positioning actually is the default positioning of all tags. Okay, so whenever you create a tag, it just goes all the way across until you give it a width. Right? So it'll fluidly move in terms of width according to its parent. So if its parent is 400, it's going to be 400. So if I take the width off my block class, I'm sure there's a shortcut for this. You see how they stretch all the way across to the width of their parent? Right? So its parent is content. Its content is the width of the shell. The shell is probably 940 or something wide.
Does the parent have padding?
Parent looks like it has left and top padding, but not right padding. But that would affect it as well.
So doing that will only stretch it to the width of its parent.
Of its parent.
The parent doesn't have specific specifications to otherwise.
Right.
So if it was like padding right 40, it would have.
Yeah, it takes into account padding or margin or like. So the main decider of width is that wrapper 000. It's got a width of 960 or 760, and so if I comment this out, let's save it. You see that now this is just statically positioning. Static positioning also implies stacking. So this green header is above content. Statically positioned elements just stack in order. Okay? So this block 1 and block 2 and block 3, they just stack because we're not telling it to be positioned any otherwise. Okay, so the characteristics of that are that they stretch according to the width of their parent, and then they stack in order. So that's just the standard static positioning. And if you ever want to know, it's right here. It's traits of statically positioned tags. Fluidly stretches horizontally, matching the width of its parent unless the width property is set. Grows vertically to contain its children / content unless the height property is set. Children that are floating can affect that property that we talked about. So the floating children don't make it grow vertically. They stack or flow in order vertically. Children position themselves relative to their parents and their siblings. So there's a child-parent sibling relationship. That makes sense. Like if you're inside a parent, you're going to be the width. You're going to be controlled by that parent's padding. You're going to be controlled by that parent's width. If you're a sibling, you're going to stack underneath your siblings. Better. that are taller than you or higher than you in order. And then it scrolls with the page. So there's also scrolling that's implied here. It also scrolls. There are types of positioning that don't scroll. Okay? So is that clear? Static positioning? It's basically the elements that you're used to working with at all times. So all the elements that you've been working with, they do this. Okay, so that's the first one. All right, so the other, that back. Save. Refresh. Okay. So these are still statically positioned. And the reason why they're not stretching is because they've all been given a width. Or the ones that the main parent, this has a width, and these have a width. Okay? Content and header don't have a width because they don't need one. They are contained by something, they're contained by this wrapper. So if the wrapper's 760, it's going to be 760. Minus that padding. Same with the content. So it's a good idea not to give something a width. If it's contained by something that has a width, then you don't have to give it a width. And to have too many numbers floating around causes a lot of problems. So you just you want to reserve giving any hard number to only when necessary. All right, so let's talk about absolute positioning. It's the next kind of most logical one. So I'm going to absolutely position this wrapper.
Okay.
So currently it's statically positioning, and we're automatically adjusting that that position of that. So here's wrapper. So I'm going to say position. I think it's position. Could be wrong, but let me look here for a second. It's been months since everybody see that? It's going the way I don't want it to go. I know. Position. Okay. So position. So I'm going to say absolute. Okay, so nothing's happened.
Position thing did highlight like the other commands.
I must have spelled it wrong. Got an I? There we go. Okay, so you see it's locked to the left. See that? Okay. So a trait of absolute positioning is it's not a fluid measurement. It's I want this box here, right? According to the XY system of its parent. So with absolute positioning, we can say, I want you to be at this top position, at this left position, at this right position, at this bottom position. Okay? So you get added properties that these don't work with static positioning. So I can say top, 0 pixels, and left, 0 pixels. And it will be 0, 0.
Smushed away at the top.
Yeah. See how it's right there and you can't see the top of that any longer?
So this is a way you would do to like center a page?
Well, we centered it with auto. You remember that? That this was originally centered, and now it's not.
Yeah.
Right? So it's a way of locking something down. I do this with logos or navigation. We'll lock it down, inside its parent.
Okay.
All right? Okay, so there's that. It also gives you this, which I think this is totally cool. So let's say you want it to be positioned on the right side of the page. Instead of saying left 0, you say right. And you still use 0, and now it'll always be locked to the right side of the page. So I'm sure you've interacted with websites with elements locked to a top or locked to a bottom or locked to a right. So that's pretty cool, I think. Okay, and that's just saying right instead of left. If you use if you use bottom, you can't use top, and if you use right, you can't use left. So top and left always prioritize. You can't position in all four places because it's impossible. You can't be left 0, 0 and right 0, 0 at the same time. It's a different type of positioning.
Okay.
That's static positioning. Okay, but yes, you could do that, but you can't do it with absolute positioning. All right, so if I take this off and I just change it to static, we're back to normal. The top has no influence over it. The right has no influence over it because it doesn't work with statically positioned tags. Okay? All right, so that was the wrapper. I'm going to leave that there. I'm going to take this off here for a second. So I'm going to target one of these blocks. Say block 1. No, let's say block 3. So I'm going to position this absolute. All right, now let's see what happened. Here it is, right 0, top 0. Notice it broke its parent. It did not recognize its parent's XY system. It stuck to the body, the 0, 0 of the body. This is cool, but more often than not, you want it to just adhere to its parent, right? You want it to be in the top right-hand corner of this blue box, not the body box. Does that make sense? So it skipped out of its parent. It's still in there. If you look at the markup, it still lives inside its parent. It's just not respecting its parent's XY coordinate system.
So with absolute, you can just completely ignore.
Can. Yes. Or you can adhere to its parent's XY system. So this is how you would do this. So one of the traits of absolute is that it does not respect statically positioned parents. It's like a wild teenager. It's like, I'm absolutely positioned. And I don't respect my parents if they're statically positioned because they're generic and they're boring and they're just the default. And I don't want my parents. I don't respect my parents for default, okay? So it only respects the other types of positions, right? Which is relative, absolute, and fixed. Okay, so I only respect those positioning. So I'm going to change the contents positioning as position to relative as a fix, and I'll explain what relative positioning is in a second. But if it's relative positioned, if it's absolute positioned, if it's fixed position, it will respect its XY coordinate system. So now I can position it anywhere within its parent, which is awesome because sometimes you want your nav to the right side, to the up-hand corner of its parent. And so now you have a really kind of clear, effective way of getting it to stay there. And of course, centering with its content. Make sense?
Wait, hey, how did you get it to stick to the...
I targeted its parent, which was content.
Okay.
So one of these things that you really have to adhere to or to understand is like the parent-child relationship with these. So blocks, all 3 blocks are inside the parent content.
Okay.
So that's always a component of these positionings, is identifying the siblings and the parent. Okay, so recognizing the nesting within that, because without that knowledge, it's kind of a guessing game.
Okay.
Okay, so then I knew I want it to adhere to content's XY system. Content is defaultly positioned static, so it won't respect statically positioned tags. So if I give it a positioning of relative, it will.
Okay, so the content tag had to be changed. It's instead of static, it had to be relative.
Relative, or it could be absolute, or it could be fixed. Relative is the easiest one. I'll tell you why in a second. Okay? So with that, now I can put block 1 wherever I want. So I can go to block 1 and change that positioning to absolute. Top 0. Left 0. And so now it's to that. Make sense? And this one is still floating around here underneath that one.
Top 0 and then
like 240 for Since I've got these numbers, I can see. So I can do block 2. This. I imagine that my parent will collapse and I'll have to give it a defined height. So 240. Yeah, so same kind of problem. This problem probably won't be fixed by changing the overflow to auto. Let's see. Maybe. Whoops. Oh, kind of did. So we're going to just give that a defined height. There it is. Okay? So now we have ultimate control over where these things go. But they're not terribly fluid. They're set in stone, and so that's one of the drawbacks is that they don't really grow or expand very easily with their content. So I use it for like logos or positioning solid elements like your nav or a bottom nav. I would probably typically absolutely position on the bottom and the top or something like that.
No real flexibility.
There is some. I mean, if you don't give it a width, it will stretch out. So you kind of learn those as you go on how to kind of manipulate it the way you want. But you can do tricky things like position it. Right now we're positioning it within a relative tag, and that relative tag grows and expands just like a static tag. So it comes with experience kind of working with them to really figure out how they work. Okay, so let's do that block 2 at bottom 0, 0. Okay? I was expecting that to be 0 of that though. All right, so that's absolute positioning. Right. Once again, if it's their parent is set to static, which is default, they won't respect their parent. They'll only respect their, the body or the next tag that isn't. So they are also inside the wrapper. So if the wrapper was relatively positioned, then they would respect the wrapper. So see how they're locked into the wrapper. So they are inside. If you look here, here's the block. They are inside wrapper because wrapper controls everything. And they are inside the body. Body's in. Okay. A lot of times, to forego these problems, I'll just make all these, like any div tag, position relative. Notice I've got a selector for just the generic div. Let's see if I can save that. Well, it didn't work. Let's see if I can do it to this, to all tags. It looks like it's not. Yeah, I wasn't remembering that. Let's put that here. Yeah. Okay. All right. So back to this. Div. I can make that relative. So most people get absolute positioned. I want it here. I want it there. Most people understand static because that's the one that they're first introduced to. Relative's a little bit more complicated. One last thing about absolute. Let's position these a little differently. Here's block 1, 0, 0. Top left. Top. Let's do top.
In case you didn't see, you added a W behind the relative position of content. I don't know if that would mess it up at all.
Yeah, I will. Thanks for that. Okay, and then block 3, top, left, 80. Okay, so now they're all stacked on. Let's put 20 on each. All right, so see how they're all stacked. Okay, so there's another property that is not available on static position tags, but all of the other positionings will allow it. There's something called Z-index, and it starts with 0 and goes up to. I'm sure there's a limit to the height of a Z-index. It's a very big number. Okay, so block 1 has the index of 100, and you see it layer above.
Okay. Wait, I remember something about this. Like it's the number you assign them on the index, and what stacks on top of something else.
Right.
Is it the highest number?
The highest number is in front.
Yeah.
So highest number is on top.
It's like three dimensions, basically.
Yeah, Z-index. It has no effect of its scale. There are transform properties that will actually let you do a Z-index. Actually make it closer or farther away. But this is like layering in Photoshop.
Right.
So block 2. So right now block 2 is underneath. So if it's higher than 100, say 200, then it will be higher. So that's how you can control layering if you have overlapping elements.
And you can do that down to a single digit, can't you?
Sure. Yeah, you can do 1, 2, 3, 4. I don't recommend it. I recommend doing in like blocks of 10s or 20s because if you order in everything like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, then what's that?
There's no room in between.
There's no room in between. That's right. So you would, if you wanted to put something at level 5, you'd have to renumber everything. But if it was like 50, you could give it a 45 and put it in between there. You're set to go. So that's a trick. That's a clever trick to adhere to. But Z-index is one of those properties. If this is set to static, they won't adhere to any of these properties, including Z-index. Okay? Alright, so relative positioning. Relative positioning is like a relative path. That name implies a relationship, right? And it's like a fluid number based in context of position. Okay, so relative path means that I could locate files according to my relative location. Okay, so I can locate you guys easily because we're in the same relative location. So relative to me, you guys are in the same room, and I can just identify you by name. Correct? If you're out in the hall or you're in the bathroom, I gotta take a path relative to this location to go find you. I have to step out in the hall, .. bathroom, find you. Might be awkward and weird, but might be an emergency or something like that. Okay, so this idea of relative positioning has that same kind of thought behind it. Okay, so the first thing you should know is like relative positioning works exactly like static positioning, except that it allows you to have a top, a bottom, well, a top, a left, a right, and a Z-index. So it works like static positioning, except it gives you access to these cool properties. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So the only difference is like, so let's target the header with this. Okay, so header positioning. Okay, position a relative, no change. Nothing happened. We cool? Okay, so this is the green box right there. So if I say though, if I say top 0, or if I say top 10 and left 10, notice it's not 1010 of its parent. Zoom in on that there for a second. So 1010 of its parent is here. So if this was absolutely positioned, it would be right there. 1010. So let's make this absolute. And just to counteract that problem, I'm going to make contents relative. So it will be Okay, so what's happening is it's not stretching the content down here, so okay, let's make having deja vu here. What my guess is it's like it's underneath this. Is what my guess is. Where else would it be? Or maybe I made a mistake here. Spell that correctly. Let's give it a z-index. I've had this happen before. Where does that go? Let's go back to relative. Alright, there it is. So it's not 1010, but let's see. We should be able to get this 1010 of its parent. So let's look at the structure here. So here's wrapper, right? Here's header. Header has no content. Let's give it some content. Okay, so that's why we weren't seeing it. Had no content. So let's change this back to absolute. So there it is. So content has a relationship to absolute positioning as well. Notice it doesn't stretch all the way across. It only stretches to the width of its content. And it doesn't have a height. Its height is based on its content as well. But notice that it's 1010 of its parent. Relative positioning is 1010 based on where it would be if it was statically positioned. Okay? So statically positioned, it would be there. Right? 40-40 because there's padding on that content. Right? So relative just adds to its starting location where it would be if it was static. Make sense? Mm-hmm. So it's relative to where it would be, and it's kind of like adding a margin or something like that. So that's how relative works. I don't do too much positioning like this with relative. I don't use top and left with relative. If I'm trying to position something, more often than not, it's absolutely positioned. But I will use relative position to fix the problem of absolute position tags floating outside of their parents. Okay, so we have static, we have absolute, which are absolutely there inside their parents, or not, depending on what their parents' positioning are. And then we have relative positioning, which is positioning itself relative to where it would be if it was statically positioned. Okay, you also have z-index. So the final one is called fixed positioning. So I'm going to use this color key for the fixed positioning example. So that is called UL key. And I'm going to position this fixed. And then I'm going to give it a bottom of 0 pixels and a right of 0 pixels. We'll see what happens. Okay, so there's the key. And notice it's at the bottom of the page. Fix is like absolute positioning, except it does not scroll with the page. So if you wanted to lock down navigation, if you've seen like bottom bars that go all the way across and they never move, those are fixed positioned elements. Does that make sense? So fixed basically works like absolute, except it does not scroll. Absolute, you put wherever you want by coordinate system. Relative is relative to its static location, and static is the default positioning. So those are the 4 different types of positioning.
Looks like an ad.
It does, yeah. And that's how they do it. Right?
With fixed, say you wanted a nav bar across the bottom, right?
Yep.
How would you dictate the width if you can adjust the window? Can you just say the margin autos?
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that. So I want a less complicated looking example. So let's just go ahead and make a new.
Fill this up a little bit.
Sure, bud.
Will we have time to hit up Fancy Bucks before?
Sure. Yeah. Cool. We'll do that.
It's like the last big thing on my list.
Yep.
For the site at least.
I love that little thing for filling up bottles and stuff. I like
Yeah, those are cool. I
They just have to make them with the line punch.
think.
So what are we working on now?
Trying to work on that example.
It's the fixed bar at the bottom, I think.
Okay, so I just made a. Just a one that's less complicated so we can focus in on the problem. Okay, so all right, so I've got this little guy here. I'm going to use an HTML5 tag or element called footer. Acts just like a div tag, except it has more context to it.
What is used for copyright stuff?
Yeah.
Different number of things.
Yep. Actually, that's a good point. So let's just use the nav tag. So there's also a nav tag, and this would be a nav, though it'd be locked at the bottom. So that's better. Okay. So background. So let's see if we can test this guy. All right, so there's our basic content right there. Okay, so this is our nav. So I'm gonna say color, just the type, the color of the type. So I'm going to have to target the wrapper. Notice that the wrapper is an ID, so it has the number sign. Alright, where did I go wrong? Here. There we go. So there's its content. Yeah? Alright, so currently it's just stacking just because it's statically positioned tag. It's going all the way across because it's statically positioned. Does that make sense? So it's only as high as its as this wrapper will let it be. Because the wrapper is only as big as its content. Very little red here. You can see that. Okay, so it's stacking that way. So let's position this fixed, which is position.
And then when, like when you place a position tag.
That's a property.
I was saying property. Sorry. When you place that property, the properties that dictate where, like top and left, they have to be below it, right?
It's not order specific for the most part. So you can put it anywhere you want to out of order, and it'll pick it up. Okay. As far as I know. Notice that fixed positioning is only as wide as its content. It doesn't stretch all the way across. So that's where width auto comes into play. I'm sorry, not auto. So in this game, you want to do a percentage with 100%. Makes sense? So that means 100% of its parent. Okay? So currently it's fixed. I don't have a top or bottom or whatever, so here it is. Right? And it doesn't scroll. But it doesn't have enough room, so it's getting hidden. Okay, so let's go ahead and fix that. So let's put it on the bottom. So I'm going to say bottom, 0 pixels, and left to get rid of that little gap. So now it's always locked. It's always locked to the bottom. And it stretches 100% of its. Okay, so if anything gets scrolled, it'll scroll underneath. Make sense? Yeah. So that's how you get kind of that more application feel, where it looks more like an app rather than a website, where you got navigation's kind of locked at the bottom. Then you would do something like this for a lot of times they'll put their copyright or Facebook or social networking things there.
What position was this one again?
Fixed.
Fixed.
Yeah, because it doesn't scroll. So if it had a lot of content in it, I'm going to temporarily give this a height of 2,000 pixels. You'll see that it won't.
Okay, so you have something there all the time. Okay.
Yeah. So if it was
I imagine you have to make that kind of small, or else it'd get really obnoxious.
Yeah, it's true.
But you can still dictate.
So there's the absolute positioning. So
you can still dictate height in the navigation bar, can't you?
Sure, or you can just make sure that the content doesn't, isn't tall like that. So this
stuff like that.
Yeah.
All right.
So that's fixed positioning. This is currently statically being positioned. And then you can position within the context of each box. So you not only have positions of those kind of big elements, but within you've got position of small elements within the context of their parents. So you get a lot of control over this. So it's an important concept to really kind of understand. And it doesn't come with like a lecture. I can introduce those concepts. I can put those words in your brain, but until you guys have an investment of trying to figure it out, running into those problems, saying, okay, it won't. It's generally not one of those things that are instant because they're generally learned within the context of working with the elements. All right, so the lab there is imperative that you do so you can get at least one or two experiences. Inevitably, you're going to run into problems where you want something somewhere, and I'll mentor you through that process too to reinforce those concepts. Okay?
That's probably why I don't have fancy box down yet.
Yeah, for sure.
Also have more, a whole class to kind of talk to.
Oh, sure.